Our first speaker is going to be Gary Marcus from NYU. He's going to be giving one of the two plenary talks for the day. Again, I don't have a prepared introduction, but I do know there was a recent book that you had authored on the subject, so we're really looking forward to hearing the details.
All right, thanks very much. The recent book that you probably alluded to is called The Future of the Brain. I'll show you a slide of it at the end, but if anything, this is really from a recent science paper called The Atoms of Neural Computation, which Conrad Korting read in draft and despised. So just so you know. The most important part of the science paper, by the way, is on bioarchive, so we had about 1,000 words to express our grand views. We used those as best we could, and then we put the rest on bioarchive. So if you really care, you can go there later. Basically, the idea that I want to talk about today is really a quest, and whether it's a well-guided quest or a misguided quest. And the quest that I want to talk about is the quest for canonical cortical computation. There's one nice formulation of it that goes all the way back to 1979. It says the neocortex can be understood as a cooperative network that acts as a nonlinear spatiotemporal filter with adaptive properties. I think that wouldn't be out of place in the introduction or the abstract of a lot of modern papers. And it says it's assumed that these filter properties are identical for all neocortical areas. I'll emphasize the identical part. With the functional role of the circumscribed cortical area depending exclusively on its position within a certain functional circuit being defined by it. So in the extreme, this means that, say, language and vision really rely on the same kinds of circuitry. It's just that language gets different inputs than vision. And I'm here to be skeptical about that, I suppose. So I have a bunch of quotes here just so that you won't believe that I'm attacking a straw man, but in the interest of time, I probably won't go over them. But the basic idea is, hey, we're just looking for a few computational principles. The variability of the input will give us the functional specialization. Now, how many people believe that as opposed to write about it? I leave that as an exercise for the reader. Here's some reasons why you might take the canonical microcircuit view seriously, and I have a little asterisk here. There are, of course, two different versions of this view. One is there's just one learning mechanism, and the other is there's one circuit. Either way, they're kind of views in which what we're looking for is homogeneity. We're looking for the right piece of homogeneity. And there's some reasons to take that view seriously. For example, the cortex is surprisingly uniform between areas and across species. I was raised, so to speak, at MIT. I was a student of Steven Pinker, and Jerry Fodor had been there not that long before, and people were looking for sort of modules for this and modules for that, and though people didn't talk in that era too much about how the brain worked, the idea was, Broca's area is going to work very differently than occipital cortex. And then, of course, you look at the data, and it becomes a little harder to believe that. Then we know from computational work, like my colleague Xiaojing Wang at NYU, to take one example, on the right, that you can tweak a particular mechanism and get qualitatively different outputs. So even if we know that language and vision are qualitatively different, that doesn't a priori prove that it isn't just one little parameter setting or 5 little parameter settings and so forth. So it's another reason that people find this view appealing. They also find it, many people find it appealing because of, I think, the most oversold study in modern neuroscience, which is Murganka Sur's very interesting study in which the way we joked about it at MIT was he connected the ear bone to the eye bone, and so he got auditory cortex to respond to visual input. Now, there's some details that people usually leave out I might come back to later. But anyway, people take these studies as a kind of argument for interchangeability of cortex. There's some stuff from Sean Hill and Henry Markram in PNAS last year. I could talk about it if people want to, but I won't immediately. And then there's the apparent success of hierarchical feature detectors. So people get a long way with unsupervised learning using hierarchical feature detectors, which are, of course, the canonical cortical computation. I'll come to them in a moment. And then there's parsimony. Like, why believe that there's more than one circuit type if you could get the whole job done with one? We, of course, have lots of examples in the history of science where people pile epicycles onto epicycles when really you wanted just one simple, smooth formulation. And so people go around looking for the canonical cortical microcircuit. Lots of people have done it. I have one of Jeff Hawkins' papers up here. I take Jeff to be in that camp. When people talk about this, they're usually in some way or another building on the Hubel and Wiesel tradition. I don't think that the quote on the left is an exaggeration to say that the Hubel and Wiesel tradition of hierarchical feature detection is the greatest single influence on the way neuroscientists think about the brain during the second half and now the first part of the 21st century. And I don't think I need to tell people in this room what those data are, and you probably all know the stuff that Christoph Koch and Itzhak Fried and Chen Choga did, where you've got what looks ostensibly like a neuron that might be a very high-level hierarchical feature detector, like one for detecting Oprah Winfrey. Of course, there are many questions here that have probably occurred to many people in the room, but ostensibly it fits pretty well with the Hubel and Wiesel tradition. It's also the impetus behind a wide range of models, going back to neocognitron, which I don't think gets its due lately in the era of deep learning, since it is a deep net, even if not a deep learned net. It's, I think, critical to Jeff's model, and it's critical to all the deep learning stuff that is breaking lots of records in speech recognition and on ImageNet. Still, I think there's some reasons to doubt the canonical circuit view. I really do think it's the default view for a lot of people, but there's still no satisfactory account of what that circuit might be. So if it exists after 40 years, nobody's managed to characterize it. Nobody can say exactly what piece of neural tissue it would be. Nobody can say exactly what the computation would be. Jeff has a hypothesis, but I don't think there's anything like a consensus. I think Bono said it best. He said, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Doesn't mean that it's not there, but it's a reason to at least ponder. The second concern, and some of what Sebastian said is very relevant here, the canonical circuit view doesn't really give any account for why cortical diversity is so pervasive. And I won't go into detail in these images, but there's cortical diversity and complexity everywhere you look. So, for example, it used to be that you couldn't give a talk in neuroscience without showing the Elman and Van Essen diagram, the point of which was the brain looks like spaghetti with a lot of complicated interconnections that we don't really understand. And if you're following the literature, the most recent versions of this done in macaque monkeys show that it's even more complicated than the Elman and Van Essen diagram, because basically every place that they didn't draw a line, it turns out there's a line, it's just not as thick. And so, varying over 5 orders of magnitude, everything connects to everything else. There's probably some systematicity there, but we don't really understand it. But this, to me, doesn't look like a simple system per se. Then, of course, there's complexity in how the 6 layers interconnect with one another. If you take away nothing else from my talk, you should take down this reference, Solari and Stoner, and look at their wonderful iPad app called Cognitive Consilience, I think, in which you can point and click on any detail in the 6-layered cortex, and you'll get 5 references for why people think that there is this particular interconnection within the 6-layered cortex. So there's enormous complexity in there. There's complexity. I have a different set of data for this than Sebastian just gave us, but there's clearly many, many neuronal subtypes. And Sebastian talked about on order of, let's say, 50 in the retina. People think that they're on the order of 500 or 1,000 in cortex. Of course, nobody can give you a straight answer as to how many, but it's clear that there are many. It's not clear how that would follow from the kind of, we've got this one canonical cortical circuit idea. Even you drill down further into individual synapses and you find there are hundreds of different proteins in each synapse, and they can vary from one to the next. Stephen Smith now at Allen Brain Institute, then at Stanford, has done beautiful work on this. So everybody likes to quote Ramon y Cajal. Well, I have my favorite Ramon y Cajal quote, which is this: unfortunately, nature seems unaware of our intellectual need for convenience and unity, and very often takes delight in computation, in complication and diversity. And as a side note, I have a book called Kludge, which is an engineer's word, probably a lot of you know, for clumsy solution to a job. The thesis of that book is that evolution doesn't look for global minima. It alights on local minima. There are lots of new things piled up on old things. And so maybe it's not an accident that nature takes delight in complication and diversity. If you don't have access to a global maxima or minima, then maybe that's what you get. And the canonical circuit view also makes little contact with a whole lot of other parts of biology. So people do pay attention to kind of the psychophysics that you can do on monkeys, single-cell recording kind of stuff. But there's lots of other things going on in biology that are not really referenced in the development of these theories so much. There's a lot of developmental biology, molecular biology, evolutionary biology. I'll come back to it later, focusing on this idea of duplication and divergence, which I take to be one of the most important things in mammalian and human evolution. It's sort of absent from these approaches typically. Then there's a problem, which is that hierarchies of feature detectors can only get you so far. They can get you a long way. I guess I'm missing a slide here about all the success of deep learning. I assume in this crowd everybody knows it's been mentioned many times. But then you find these kinds of things, even this has already been mentioned today. Somebody showed the Nguyen et al. Slide where you can have a deep net that mistakes a pattern of yellow and black stripes for a school bus. And there's another paper called Intriguing Properties of Neural Networks. So the deep learning systems are doing, I think, a very good job at low-level sensory perception. They're doing a brilliant job of acquiring features without having to have engineers hand design each input feature, but they're still not really getting to the high-level perception that would tell you the difference between a school bus and somebody wearing a t-shirt with the stripes from a school bus. So there's some kind of higher-level stuff that's still being missed from deep learning. And there are also sharp limits, and this is what I most care about as a former student of Steven Pinker's. They're very sharp limits on what you can do with the current crop of machine learning models when it comes to language. So I just had a workshop, and Jan LeCun, who's now director of AI at Facebook, came and said, oh, but we've solved this now. I've been arguing with Gary for years, but the people in my lab at Facebook, they have this great new memory network stuff. It's not yet published, but it's online. You can find it. Called memory networks. And I think it's a step in the right direction in that I think you want your hierarchical feature detectors to in some way interface with short-term memory stores, and they've got some thoughts about how to do that. And ostensibly it's really impressive, so you can tell it a story. This is in the bottom figure. Basically you tell it a story about the Lord of the Rings, and it seems to answer questions about it. So you say Bilbo traveled to a cave, and Gollum dropped a ring there, blah, 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 and then you say things like, where is a ring? But it turns out it's the same thing as like the microworlds that people were doing in MIT in the 60s with lifting blocks, which is it's a very narrow domain, and things don't go very far. So I gave a talk at Facebook a week later. If any Apple experts can tell me how to stop looking for a server that no longer exists, I would very much appreciate it. I meant to turn off the Wi-Fi for this reason. So I went, and I mentioned briefly, I have a little startup company now. So my CTO and I went and dissected this model basically over a weekend, and we came up with about 20 things that we thought you wouldn't be able to do with this latest, greatest language model that's kind of in the hierarchical feature detection tradition. Things like recursion, so it does Q&A, but it's not going to be able to do things like who married the person that exchanged vials of blood with Billy Bob Thornton. We conjectured it's going to have problems with word order and syntax, with negation, which Bond movies didn't Roger Moore star in, and so forth and so on. So we came up with this list of 20, and I presented it at Facebook, and I expected them to yell at me and say, you Marcus, you're always skeptical about our models, and you know, we've solved all the problems. Instead, they sat there quietly and said, yeah, you're right. So there's still a long, long way to go in getting linguistic models out of anything that's in the machine learning sphere. So my bottom line on this is that hierarchies of feature detectors aren't on par with human performance. So they can get pieces of things. They can probably recognize texture as well as people. If you have a narrow, let me rephrase that. If you have a fixed set of categories, then these models are competitive with people. So in ImageNet, you have 1,000 categories, and that's it. You have a closed world. Here, sometimes DeepNet can actually beat people. But if you have an open world, that's not going to happen. As soon as you get into an open world, these things start to be relatively easily fooled. I don't want to say that low-level sensory perception doesn't involve hierarchical feature detection. That would be foolish. I'm sure that it does. But I do want to say that this one approach of looking for a single canonical computation that basically does some variation on hierarchical feature detection is not going to get us far enough. It's not going to get us to language. It's not going to get us to abstract reasoning, things like that. For me, all of this hinges on something that I've been arguing about for, I guess, about 20 years, particularly in a book called The Algebraic Mind, MIT Press, 2001, which is that in any computer program, you start with operations over variables. So you have a function that's defined to work for particular variables. And once you've defined it for those particular variables, you don't need to see every instance of the thing that it applied to. So you have addition. You don't learn addition by seeing a full times table. You have a built-in system that's going to get you there. And I've shown a bunch of kinds of cases that are easy for people and very difficult for backprop nets. They turn out to be hard for deep learning too. Like the most popular model at the time of language was Elman's simple recurrent network. and I showed you could give it sentences like a rose is a rose. I think of this as the Gertrude Stein sentences. A tulip is a tulip, a lilac is a lilac, and then you try to predict what comes next. A lily is a blank. And there's no general perception of the abstract relationship that's there, even though it's immediately obvious to a person with 3 training examples. So you think, deep nets can do great when you have a million training examples, but there are certain kinds of generalizations that people can do with a few examples. I had an article in Science that's illustrated in the right part, where I gave 7-month-old babies sentences like la ta ta, ga na na, and so there was an ABB structure, and the 7-month-old babies who weren't paid for their participation or didn't get any extra credit or anything like that were able in 2 minutes to figure out what was going on. They were surprised when we changed the grammar. So we controlled, so it wasn't just new words, but you could see new words, new grammar, new words, old grammar, and they could tell the difference. And then what happens in developmental psychology, which is sort of my core discipline, is whenever you show something, someone else says, yeah, well, I can get younger kids to do it. And so somebody showed that newborns can do the same thing. So that's not a perfect argument for innateness, but it's not a bad argument to get started, that maybe there's something intrinsic to our minds that allows us to do these generalizations. And meanwhile, I showed that backprop nets, which were the popular thing back when I was working on this and are precursors to deep learning, couldn't do the same kind of thing. So you train them on identity for the even numbers, they don't generalize to the odd numbers. And this turns out to be true for an infinite range of functions that are what I would call universally quantified one-to-one mappings. I won't go through it in too much detail now. Turns out that adding hidden units doesn't help. We've now replicated this with deep learning, and deep learning has the same problem. The way I think about it is there are some problems you can solve by looking at a training space of examples that you've seen before and interpolating within them. So if I give you some set of even numbers, and now I test you on a new even number, that might be fine. It might be close enough to what you've seen before. But now if I test you on a number that's bigger than what you've seen before, or an odd number and you've not seen that digit before, if you're using a classification approach like backprop or deep learning, you're out of luck. This doesn't mean you can't build a neural network that operates over variables. So I'm not saying, hey, anybody that's studying neural networks is wasting their time. What I'm saying is we need to enrich our vocabulary of primitives that we think about in the neural network. So you can, in fact, build neural networks that extrapolate the right way. Somebody in this room has built one. They may not appreciate my characterization. But I would say that what you can do, or what you need to do, is to have something that represents a variable, an instance, a binding between the two, and a way of performing operations that are defined over those relationships. I have that up here. So you need operations like add, store, concatenate. I mean, as someone who studies linguistics, I look at all these models that don't have concatenate operations, like concatenating 2 elements of a string like you'd find in Lisp or Python or anywhere else, and I just don't understand what people are doing. So here, briefly, is a model of Randy O'Reilly's. We could talk about the details, but it actually turns out to be an implementation of variable binding. And you might be, I don't see where Randy is sitting anymore, but it's an implementation of variable binding. It's a neural network. It operates on different principles than, say, deep learning. I think we need to look at a broader set of principles. I'm not going to say the specific one here. And then Randy gets much better generalization than anybody else does doing a task like what I was describing, which is the rightmost bar there. It's a PNAS paper 2 years ago. So look, people have a certain set of streetlights in machine learning. We know lots about feature hierarchies, and lots of people are looking under that streetlight. And then there are other ones. People are looking at state spaces and sparse codes and population codes. And all I'm really saying is we're never going to get to language without a better understanding of how the brain does operations over variables, that we need another streetlight for that. Here's another way of putting the whole conversation I'm trying to have, which is all of Cortex the same? Well, here are some hypotheses. One is that prefrontal areas work just like sensory areas, right? We have a handle on low-level sensory areas. Is that a good model for the rest of Cortex? Well, could be. I mean, this is one of the hypotheses out there. It's all basically the same stuff. It's just you're in a different part of the cortical hierarchy, so you've got a different set of inputs, but it's really basically the same equation all the way through. Another hypothesis is prefrontal areas work mostly like sensory areas, but with some minor parametric differences. And my colleague Xiaojing Wang is to some extent pursuing that. So he's saying, well, what if we tweak parameters like how persistent something is in a recurrent network? Well, then you could get longer memory, less direct sensitivity to stimulus. And I think that that's partly on the right track. I think we do want to look at properties like that. But I want to argue for something a little bit more radical, which is that prefrontal areas might have some resemblance to sensory areas, because after all, there was one set of brain circuitry early on that everything's evolved for, but that over evolutionary time, there's a lot of room to develop qualitative and quantitative variations on a theme. So Xiaojing Wang is emphasizing the quantitative variations on a theme, so I tweak this parameter and have more persistence. But you could have, if you think at the level of like gates in a computer, you could have very different kinds of circuit types if you could reconfigure different parts and do that molecularly and not just on the basis of experience. Then there's, I think, another possibility, which is like prefrontal areas are totally different from sensory areas because they solve different sorts of adaptive problems. And if that would be the naive interpretation of evolutionary psychology, right? You read Pinker talking about you have a mental Rolodex and you do something for kin relationships and so forth. There are like 15 different adaptive problems, and the notion is they're each solved differently. Well, I don't really see the neural evidence for that either. So I wind up at number 3, the one that I've bold-faced, that maybe we want to be looking at evolved variations on themes that give you qualitative difference. So here's a conjecture which somebody else already refuted today in a different context, but I will stand by, which is the idea that maybe, I'll even just skip this one, that the brain is something like an FPGA. So here's what I mean by something like an FPGA. Obviously, the power requirements are an anathema to the people in this room. And for building neuromorphic stuff, you don't literally want an FPGA. But here's what I like about the FPGA metaphor and that I think is worth thinking about. You've got a physically identical substrate across the whole width of your circuit. You can do computation in parallel. It doesn't have to be a serial system. There's some ways you can kind of finesse and get a bit of serialism in there. But you have something that ostensibly looks similar, like the Cortex looks ostensibly similar, and yet you can tweak each cell in this thing or each logic block in this thing to do something different. So you could have a pretty broad diversity of logic blocks within one FPGA, doing, say, signal detection and doing arithmetic and doing memory and so forth. Well, maybe the brain is at least a little bit like that. So ostensibly you have a uniform substrate, but maybe when you drill down to the synapse level, which we can't really do that much yet, maybe you find important differences. So there's a common, let's say, skeleton, but it's tweaked in different ways. And you can think like the differences between a hand and a foot or an arm and a wing. You can get on a common architecture fairly different kinds of systems. Well, why not think that we have that in the cortex? Half of our genome is devoted to building the brain, basically. Well, maybe all of that stuff is there to do some pretty fine-grained stuff so that different areas of the cortex are actually doing different computations. You could imagine they're all variations on, let's say, central pattern generators that we had 50 million years ago in evolution, but if you tweak those things over enough time, you might have a broad set of primitives. So here's sort of 3 overall views. One is that you've got these canonical cortical microcircuits tuned by experience. The anatomy is essentially uniform. The computations are essentially identical. And everything is tuned by experience. Maybe this is a caricature, but I don't think it's far from what a lot of people talk about. Then there's another position that's out there, which is the fMRI literature, which kind of assumes that the anatomy is heterogeneous. I mean, people talk about, Broca's area does this, and V1 does this, and so forth. Computations are implicitly assumed to be heterogeneous, and nobody really talks in that literature much about development. That's another kind of view where it would be all bespoke circuitry in each different area. What I'm arguing for is different. I'm saying that Cortex might be an array of reconfigurable computational elements, where the anatomy is largely shared at the broad level, but then there's fine-tuning, a lot of it molecular, for individual blocks. Computations would be tinkered variations on themes rather than just one master computation. And wiring, I agree with everybody else that shaping by experience is really important. We can calibrate almost anything that we do, but I would put much more weight on what all those genes are doing to lay down the base circuitry before the calibration. There's lots of things. If you think the brain might be made up of building blocks like this, you could get hints both from bottom-up neuroscience and from top-down psychology and cognitive science. So bottom-up, for example, you can imagine circuitry that relies on topographic mappings, lateral inhibition, nothing that's going to surprise anybody in this room, hierarchical feature detectors, winner-take-all networks, SynFire chains, and what have you. But you could also look to cognitive science and say, and I'm sorry the font's small, no one in the back can see, but you can imagine that we might, for example, have a mechanism for working memory storage where you can store something on one trial. I can tell you, I will meet you afterwards at 5 o'clock on one trial, and you can show up without needing the 500 things that an aplesia does in order to learn to stop retracting its gill. Variable binding, I just don't see how to do linguistics without it, and I think many people have tried and not gone very far. I can see reason to have copy and paste I put this slide together before the neural Turing machine, but I think it's actually got a version of that if I'm not misremembering. Mechanisms for storage of temporal sequences, for gating information flow, which is something I think we talk about way too little in the machine learning and computational neuroscience field, and people started to talk about it a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of fMRI, but if there's one thing that we've learned from that literature, it's that to do any task, the brain is completely reallocating what circuitry it's going to do in that minute, doing it very, very quickly. We don't really have a way of thinking about that with respect to our models, and we ought to. So what I really like to see, and this is really straight from David Marr, slightly updated, is a table, and I know you can't all see it, but the idea is you've got computation going across algorithmic representation of realization, neural implementation, and brain areas. And I've been toying with crowdsourcing this, and we have a draft on the archive article. And then going down, we have things like rapid perceptual classification, working memory, decision-making, gating of information flow, and so forth. And part of the point of this table is we already actually have some ideas as a field collectively strewn about in far quarters, people who have ideas about how you might do variable binding or how you might do gain control and so forth. But not that many people are talking about, well, what if you had all of these things as primitives the way that you've got different kinds of logic gates, and you can put them all together rather than just looking for one. There's just not enough work doing that. That's part of the point here. The other part is if we tried to work out a table like this in detail, if we're doing neuromorphic stuff, for example, we could abstract. We could say what I want is the algorithmic representation. I need variable binding, but I don't need to do it with spikes. There are other ways to do it. Maybe I can do it more efficiently. And so if we wanted to build a neuromorphic stuff, we ought to have this kind of computational abstraction if we're to have some success. A couple of reasons why you might take this whole idea seriously. One is it gives you some entree into functional diversification. I think there's too many things on this slide, but the fact that we have different brain areas that are at least doing different functions doesn't entirely follow from the hierarchical feature detectors. But this gives you a wedge into thinking about, like, why is the character of language so different from the character of vision? So when people talk about language, they're talking about how you parse sentences into units. There's a lot of talk about recursion, mapping between syntax and semantics. It's like a different language than people use to talk about vision. Well, if it was all from the same machinery, we'd be in trouble. But if there was different kinds of machinery, we might have a chance of answering that. And then I already hinted at this about developmental and evolutionary biology. If there's one thing that comes through from that literature, huge literature in the last few decades, it's that duplication and divergence is one of the most powerful things that has shaped the way that our genome works. So you have a single gene, let's say one that builds a photoreceptor that gives you black and white vision. You duplicate it, now you have two, one of them varies, then you have two different bits of sensitivity in the color spectrum. Then you could actually have color vision. So a single gene duplication with divergence can completely change the phenotypic landscape, even though it's only a tiny change in genotype space. And this happens over and over and over again. So the one gene that we know is tied to language for sure is FOXP2. Actually, maybe there are two genes now. But FOXP2 is part of the fork-head set of proteins. It turns out there's one in flies, but then there's been a bunch of duplication, and it's clear that we actually have two different fork-head P1 and P2, and then there's another family. There's these families of genes that take on specialized function. Humans have had a lot of this stuff, and if we're trying to understand, as I am, why humans can have language and how you could build AI systems that understand it and so forth, I think this is a deeply important notion that's just completely left out of most discussion of canonical cortical circuits. I promise I'd come back to the SIR stuff. So he connects the eye bone to the ear bone, and everybody says, look, cortex is interchangeable. But you have to remember that those results have only been demonstrated between primary sensory areas. And there's some a priori reason to think that primary sensory areas, especially if you leave olfaction out of the picture, if you're just talking about vision and audition, they're doing frequency transforms and so forth. They're maybe not that fundamentally different. If you look at the genetics, they both use ephrin ligands and F receptors. Like the biology of them is very similar. And what you're doing is you can think of it on a dating model. We're saying the vision stuff can't date its usual partner in the visual cortex, the stuff that's coming from the lateral geniculate. So it looks for the next best thing, which is auditory cortex, that's labeled with almost the same molecules. Okay, fine, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to do the same thing if you move over to prefrontal cortex. In the subsequent 2 decades, nobody has ever shown that you could do anything other than interchangeability in sensory cortex. I asked Morgan Kassur about this, and he said, almost a verbatim quote, well, we tried, but we didn't try that hard. And what I take that to mean is like, I had 3 postdocs work on it for 5 years, I got nothing, and I decided to choose another research problem. So our position is that the uniform cortical microcircuitry idea hasn't really been shown to even remotely account for the diversity of computational functions that we see implemented in the cortex. The Fpga idea gives you some at least possible toehold into thinking about functional diversity. So we predict, well, I haven't gone through this part, I guess I cut a slide, but I'll just skip that actually. Let me give you a little bit of evidence that's consistent with our view, some of which is very old. Nobody really knows what to do with Brodmann areas, but we know they exist. They presumably exist for a reason. They're reasonably replicable. I don't think they're as neat and clean as Brodmann made them out to be, but there's something going on there. How does that relate? I mean, even if you don't believe what I'm saying, you should still think, if you come from the canonical view, like why do we find these different areas? Nowadays, we can find some differences at the anatomical level. They're still less than we might have expected, but they're certainly there. Now we also see gene expression differences across the cortex. These are data from the Allen Institute, which I should say I'm a consultant at, showing that the further away two areas are, the more different their gene expression is. Most of the genes are expressed similarly, but don't forget that most of the genes are the same in the hand and the foot, but the hand and the foot have been tuned to different adaptive purposes and function in a different kind of way. And then if you sort of took a synthetic biology perspective and said, if I wanted to build an FPGA using essentially a tested, known biological mechanisms, could I do it? Turns out the answer is probably yes. So another piece of work at the Allen Institute shows, for example, that there are combinatorial genetic codes where the difference in one gene means you project here or there. So there are codes where like 5 or 6 genes specify where you project to. And so that gives you a part of the machinery that you would need to have a molecular FPGA. Then there's all kinds of interesting stuff coming out about alternative splicing, which would give you another mechanism by which small molecular differences could build, say, to different complements of synapses in different places. And interestingly, some of this stuff works both on molecular cues and also on activity dependence. So you could have some kind of synthesis of a kind of nativist, molecularly driven thing with activity dependence. So here's a summary, and then I'll take your questions. I would argue that in the domains of computational neuroscience, machine learning, and so forth, comparatively little attention has been paid to models that incorporate a rich set of basic computational circuit types. That most of the emphasis has been on, let me find one and let me see how far I can get with it. And there's nothing wrong with taking that approach and understanding how far you can get with it. But what I would say is if you look, nobody's gotten very far in language or in higher level cognition, planning, and domains like that. And it's maybe time to look for somewhere else. And yet, architectures where there is a rich set of basic circuit types seem like a natural choice given our understanding of the brain's development and function, or looking at, say, the data that Sebastian gave us where there's so many different neuron types. Like, why not try to understand things in these ways? So I think this conjecture also provides a possible conceptual framework for bridging between neural structures and computational functions. Like if the objective, well, I'll rephrase it. Everybody's trying to figure out, we've got these brain initiatives and so forth. What should our goal be here? One goal is like, let's map everything. Let's find out all the cell types. Let's find out all the connections. Well, what if your objection was really to build something like that table that I had before, where you have, say, 14 basic computations, how they might be neurally realized, where they might be neurally realized. Well, that's a different kind of target. They're not fully incompatible, but I'm kind of arguing for the latter. And the exciting thing is that new tools mean we might actually be able to test these things. So I was a cognitive scientist, and I was a cognitive scientist who was really basically bored by fMRI. You got a single voxel has 70,000 neurons. You're never going to understand from a voxel containing 70,000 neurons how it is that any of those really does its computation, because something's going on at a lower level. But now we have a lot of tools where we can, for example, actually control individual neurons. We can look at individual circuits. We have some chance that we might be able to think about these kinds of ideas. And the last thing I'll say is, of course, it's very early days. I should have said out loud, my collaborators here are Tom Dean, who's at Google working on their connectomics project, and Adam Marblestone, who's a postdoc in Ned Boyden's lab. And we would welcome help is the last thing that I say, because we know we are biting off more than we could possibly chew by ourselves. Thanks very much. Questions, complaints? Not the reaction I was expecting.
At least one question. This could have been addressed to the previous speakers, but I see that assumption is that neocortex, at least, is a fixed circuit, hardwired fixed circuit. have you considered possibility that neocortex might be something other than that?
So, I mean, I tried to say the word activity dependence a bunch of times. I certainly don't think it's fixed. I think that the way to think about neocortex is in terms of a rough draft that is genetically allocated, and then there are lots of processes that calibrate it. And I guess there are more radical possibilities. I mean, lots of people think about neocortex as basically having almost no initial structure, and it's entirely tuned by learning, which I don't...
Why genetically? There is development, and there is also the real time.
Yeah, so I'm not... What I'm trying to argue is these things are more compatible than people seem to recognize, and that they're ignoring one at the expense of the other. So almost all the work in computational neuroscience is to talk about what we would do if we had some circuit in place, typically a very stylized circuit, and then we would recalibrate on the incoming data. And the thing is that you look at organisms in the world, and they're not starting as entirely blank slates. And there's ample reason, I think, from the cognitive science literature to believe that human infants and other kinds of infants come to the world with some kind of structure that they use to then learn things about. So, for an example that cognitive scientists would be comfortable with, but not necessarily computational neuroscientists, it's not obvious if you're born without knowing that there are objects, space, and time, how you are going to learn them. And so people try all kinds of empiricist approaches in the cognitive science literature where you basically start with nothing and you try to induce concepts like these. And they've really not gotten very far. For example, there's a field called Developmental Robotics. And you can watch videos of this stuff on the web. The idea is you get the cutest robot that you can buy, that your budget will allow, and then you hold a ball and you put the ball back and forth in front of the robot. So it's an embodied robot. It can see things. It can touch things. And you say, look at the ball. You pay a graduate student, look at the ball, look at the ball. There are really videos like this out there. And they never get anywhere. So I've been reading this literature for 20 years, never seen anything. I have a 2-year-old child. I did a little bit of look at the ball thing. He's way ahead of any of these robots. I mean, he's now speaking in full sentences, complex discourses, where he relates one idea to another and describes his plans and things like that. Nobody is getting anything like that out of these more empiricist approaches that just start with, I've got a lot of sensation, and I've got motion, I'm embodied, and so forth. It's just not getting there. And I think it's time to look at something different.
Would it make sense to just agree that we're not going to talk about language yet? Just take it off the table and just say, let's work on...
I mean, you could. I expressed this mostly about language, but let's say, like the person who just walked to the microphone, that you cared, for example, about parsing a scene.
Hypothetically.
So I'll take your question in a second, if I'm not presupposing it. Or anticipating it. Let's say that you cared about a scene. I think some of the same issues will arise. I'm more comfortable giving the arguments about language because I've thought more deeply about language and because I think there's actually a more systematic theory of language than there is of scene comprehension. But let's say you were doing scene comprehension. Well, I can see how you can take deep learning as the input to your scene comprehension system, but nobody is doing end-to-end scene comprehension where they can describe all of what's going on, for example. You might know these papers by Fei-Fei Li and Ori Vinales that just came out where you try to describe a scene or something like that. These things are a very long way away from being particularly effective. They don't even have accuracy data in the Google paper that was written up in the New York Times. As an aside, and then I'll take the next question, another side of what I do, as lately I've been trying to get people to revisit the Turing test, and I had a symposium at AAAI, which we got a lot of media coverage, where we're trying to have a new set of tests to try to move AI towards more sophisticated goals, let's say. One of the things we specifically proposed was a test where you have to answer comprehension questions about an arbitrary video or scene and so forth, and I'd be happy to talk about that later.
Yeah. There was actually a question. One of the publicly posted questions on the BA relates to what you just said, the relationship between scene parsing and language as an abstract version of that. But that wasn't my question. What my question was going to be is you have in this conjecture, as you envision this modularity, this FPGA being implemented, do you think of it as spatially constrained sort of modules in the way that you might think of in VLSI, where you have individual instances of these circuits? Or do you think of these as functions that do not necessarily take a conserved form as they're distributed across the brain?
I wish I knew is probably the only honest answer. So, I mean, it could conceivably be that the things that I'm calling computational building blocks actually exist at different levels of representation. So there might be some that are at the level of a single neuron. They're very localized. Some of them are sets of neurons that are adjacent. And some of them might be, more global, and you could imagine complicated things like superimposing things with tensors and so forth, so they might be a lot harder to track down. I don't really have a commitment there. I mean, I think it's one thing to have a commitment to, if I have any commitment at all, to the abstract notion that we're looking for higher level computational primitives, and another to say I know how they're realized when we don't really have the data.
But one of those two hypotheses seems like it would be more experimentally testable.
Yeah, one's a lot more amenable. I mean, here's another very broad way of kind of reconfiguring what I said, which is we're pretty good at things computational neuroscience-wise, pretty good at things that you can solve strictly locally. So you can build up everything is local in a hierarchical feature detector in some way. And you can build systems that do that pretty well. But like in language, you need to be able to work with units that are at a great distance, for example. I'm not quite making this as sharp as I think I could. But the algorithms, here I'll give another example, make it better. The Hebbian rule is strictly local. And so you can set things up as a categorization problem. You can learn those categories one by one, independent of knowing anything else. But in language and higher level reasoning, planning, and so forth, you seem to have operations that you can apply arbitrarily to many, many cases. You don't have to sort of like, I tried this on my nearest neighbor. Like, you can do this across a very broad range of cases. And we don't have the tools yet for describing how those are realized neurally. I mean, there's some hypotheses, like Randy O'Reilly's got one. But in general, our expertise pertains to things that are represented locally. And we know there are long-range connections that are doing something, and there's probably room for something we don't understand yet what it is.
Thank you.
As a movement scientist, I just want to point out that a lot of what you
As
say...
a what? Sorry?
As a movement scientist, I just want to point out that a lot of the things you said about language are true about movement as well. There's no local solutions. There's certainly a sense of composability where you can take multiple movements, put them
That's
together.
right. It's one thing to say, I'm going to learn the mapping of my arm to things here, like one individual thing in joint space and external space. But to put those all together so that I'm going to learn a new skill or I'm going to walk from here to there, it starts to look more compositional.
It starts looking very similar, and language is just a coprocessor for movement.
You're not the first person to say that. It could also be a souped up version of what we need to do for movement. So, I mean, an interesting thing is that we have language, other species don't. We don't have that much genetic change. And so a plausible thing is that whatever language is, it's an acceptation of something else. What would be the most plausible thing to be accepted from? I'm pretty happy to say motor, because motor is a domain where you need to have a kind of hierarchical composition of units. So that's a good place to look, in my view.
Just a comment on the Turing test. I've been in discussions with other groups about this. It seems a little premature to try to go beyond the Turing test, because I'm not sure we've ever really done the real Turing test. The way Turing defined it was very broad, and what gets done in practice with these stunts is a very narrow version of it.
I mean, I think there's room for someone to try to rescue the test. I think the problem with the original Turing test is it encourages evasion, basically. So the systems that are good at these things go back to, like, Parry was a AI system that tried to pretend to be paranoid, and so had an excuse not to answer your questions, to Eugene Gustman, that, quote, won the Turing test, depends on your criteria, last year. And what it did was it pretended to be a 13-year-old boy from Odessa who didn't know English, didn't really know that much content knowledge, and so, again, basically evaded the questions. And so if you wanted to kind of preserve as closely as possible Turing's original test, but still make this useful for AI so that the research that was being done actually led somewhere, you'd have to deal with that problem of evasion.
Turing left very open domains. Basically, when you sat down with the agent, you could go anywhere you wanted.
Well, that's true with Eugene Gustman if I give you 2 minutes.
Blown out water by anyone who is really trying to suss out the agent versus the human.
I mean, there are other ways you could deal with the rules, but I will say this for Eugene Gustman, it can evade any question in any domain, so it was open, but you can still pretend. Well, that's the question, is how do you get around that? But since that's not the central focus here, I won't take any more questions on it immediately. All right, we probably need to go on to the next talk. Thanks very much.